Let's keep reading this and finish this part out tonight. Pastor Guzik's point number B, he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. Is this Christ confirming a new covenant with the people of Israel, or with the many, meaning the body of Messiah, for 1 week? I've heard this interpretation put forth by some Bible teachers, and I think there might be even a kind of a spiritualized sense, an allowable, allegorical sense of the word, that Jesus did, as it were, confirm a covenant with his death on the cross. He definitely brought the new covenant into reality with his death. And yet, I don't believe, this is my own perspective, I don't believe that's what Daniel's talking about here. I believe what Daniel's talking about, the he, my understanding is that the he is this Antichrist figure of the future. He's not on the scene yet. And it was not the Antichrist who lived in the sense of Antiochus Epiphanes. He's a type and shadow, right? He's a shadow of the Antichrist. But I believe the he that Daniel's talking about here is the Antichrist of the future. And the covenant that he confirms with 1 week, I take it in its most literal sense, natural sense, that it's the last 7 years that Daniel already prophesied about in the set, and that's the week, and the covenant is some sort of agreement that this leader, this world leader, this very, what we can say charismatic leader, he makes this covenant not just with Israel, but obviously must be made with Israel and her neighbors in some sort of peace agreement. Perhaps it's an agreement that's already on the books that he simply revives. Perhaps he drafts up a brand new one, something to that effect. The word confirm in the Hebrew doesn't mean that it has to be completely brand new. It can allow for something that's simply strengthened that was already there, but didn't have any legs to it, right? So we've got any number of different peace accords. If this is a future prophecy, we've got any number of peace accords that are already drawn up on Israel's books between Israel and her surrounding her immediate neighbors, right? The Palestinians and the Arab people groups that are immediately her immediate neighbors. We've got any number of peace accords that could be, if possible, brought to the table, given some sort of strengthening, right? Confirming, and then simply stamped into existence and brought it to life. So it doesn't have to be something brand new, is the point I'm trying to make. I do believe this is a future-facing prophecy. The he is the Antichrist, and the confirming of a covenant is, again, something that is probably already on the books, that he just simply pulls out of draft form and reworks it and puts some confirmation to it, and then implements it, puts it into perspective, puts it into practice. And the many is the Jewish people and her neighbors. That's what I see this prophecy speaking of. Again, some people say this could be the confirming of a covenant with Jesus. Again, if I allow that possibility or interpretation, it's only on the spiritual sense, because Jesus confirming of the covenant with many for 1 week doesn't seem to fit the rest of what the prophecy talks about, how this same he destroys the temple and the people of this he. Well, who's the people of he if it's Jesus that's destroying the temple, right? Those are some odd details. The coming prince will make a covenant with Israel for the final unit of 7 years, completing the 70 weeks prophesied for the Jewish people and Jerusalem. I take Guzik's view here. Covenant with many, the word many here is a specific reference to Israel, not a general reference to a group. In other words, if the many here is literal and we're talking about a final 7 years in the future, the many that the covenant is made with is the Jewish people and her surrounding within the perspective of her surrounding enemies or her surrounding neighbors, right? If there's a peace treaty drawn up with Israel and it doesn't include the surrounding neighbors, well, then it's going to fall apart. So common sense dictates that it must include the surrounding neighbors of Israel. I mean, that's what the peace treaty is for, is some type of agreement. So her neighbors are going to be at the table when this covenant is discussed. There's just no way around it. It's not going to be the Antichrist in Israel behind closed doors, right? It'll be the Antichrist, Israel, and her whatever representative leaders of those surrounding people groups. And it'll probably be very public. It'll probably be, I say probably, I could be wrong, but I mean, every other peace accord that has taken place between Israel and her neighbors, going all the way back to, I'm trying to remember when President Carter was brokering a peace treaty with Israel and her neighbors. Then we had We've had Netanyahu there. We've had Yitzhak Rabin in the picture. We've had Arafat in the picture in the past. And then more recently, we've had Trump and Netanyahu. Was it Netanyahu? I don't think it was so, but it was Trump and whoever the Arab representatives were. I'll flash a little picture on the screen so you guys can see what I'm talking about. But the point being is, was it in secret? No. Right? If a peace agreement's going to be brought to the table that's going to have any lasting effect, at least for 7 years or longer, it might even, the language might not even say 7 years. On the paper, it might be longer, but the Antichrist knows in his mind and in his heart that it's going to be much shorter. And indeed, as we're going to find out next week, he's going to cut that thing in half at the 3.5 year mark and say, that's it. I can't put up with you guys anymore. Let's just start the doom and gloom program. Let's start the death program. Let's fire up the death camps and just, fry up everybody like the ancient other Nazi type Antichrist figures like Hitler did, right? Let's just turn on the Jewish people and annihilate them. That's what Antichrist himself is going to do when he breaks his covenant in the middle of the week, which we're going to read about here in a moment. But the point I'm trying to bring up is, will this covenant be in secret? Probably not. I could be wrong. Could be behind closed doors and no one's going to see it, but it's very unlikely that Israel can do anything like with this lasting magnitude in secret. So the many here is probably with Israel and her neighbors. I don't take this to be the many, meaning all of the saved individuals that Jesus cut the new covenant with. This would seem to suggest some sort of replacement theology. Not replacement theology, but a form of limiting the scope of the covenant that Jesus cut to only existing with the many people from the New Testament point going forward. But we know that people have been saved before that, right? Abraham was saved, Moses was saved. So, did Jesus cut the covenant with them as well? We have to talk about those words. So let's see what Guzik has to say here. Roman numeral 2, with this covenant, Israel will embrace the Antichrist as a political Messiah, if not the literal Messiah. Jesus predicted this in John 5:43 with this quote, I've come in my Father's name and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, him you will receive. Yeah, okay, that seems to fit. Point number 3 is we're drawing the study to a close tonight, taking the description of what would be accomplished in the 70 weeks from Daniel 9:24. We know that the 70 weeks are not yet complete. Again, this is in contradistinction to the preterist perspective, who says, nope, it is complete. The hyper-preterists, full-blown preterists, and even many of the partial preterists put a lot of these events in the year 70 AD, first century. But those of us who are futurist, like myself, which includes a good portion of Christianity today, although not all, right? A good chunk of Catholicism, Lutheranism, Greek Orthodoxy, and Presbyterianism, to name just a few, as well as I believe the Jehovah's Witnesses, they take the kind of amillennialist, kind of non-literal preterist perspective where there isn't a literal kingdom that we're looking forward to, and therefore none of these events really need to be locked into specific time periods and things like that. But Guzik says that we know that the 70 weeks are not yet complete according to the literal, the more taking the verse in its normative, historical, grammatical perspective. Yet the events, he says, prophesied in the first 69 weeks are fulfilled, indicating that there is a lengthy pause in the 70 weeks between the 69th week and the 70th week. So just flashed a little chart that shows the graph of the gap. That's what Guzik is describing where I'm moving my mouse around in the middle there, the gap there. That's what he's talking about when he says between the 69 weeks and the 70th week. Guzik continues, the 70th week will begin when the coming prince shall confirm a covenant with the Jewish people. These gaps or pauses in prophecy may seem strange to us, but they are common. Comparing Isaiah 9:6 and Luke 1:31 through 33 shows another significant pause or gap in prophecy regarding the coming of the Messiah. So it's not unusual to have gaps in prophecy. Remember the prophetic telescoping, the two mountain peaks, one closer to the prophet, one farther away from the prophet. A gap is that valley between the two mountain peaks that the prophet may or may not be aware of, because from his perspective, his what we might call the optical illusion that's created by looking at two mountain peaks, from that perspective, you don't know the distance between those mountain peaks. You don't know what that valley entails, how many years it entails. Guzik continues, Roman numeral point number 4. And we're drawing our study to a close tonight. We can think of it this way. God appointed 490 years of special focus on Israel in his redemptive plan. The years were paused by Israel's rejection of Jesus. Now, there is no special focus on Israel in God's redemptive plan because this is the time of the church, or the times of the Gentiles. I'm adding my own wording there. Guzik continues, God's focus will return to Israel when the church is taken away at the rapture, a point I disagree with, but let's let Guzik speak, and the last 7 years of man's rule on this earth begin. So right away we can see Guzik is showing that he is a pre-tribber. He believes that the church will be removed from earth at the rapture, which takes place immediately prior to the 7-year tribulation. So let's see if this chart shows it that way. This chart doesn't show it that way, but this one does. This one has the rapture taking place immediately before the last 7 years, that bright red square in the middle of your screen that says the tribulation, 7 years. And notice there's a little arrow pointing up at the beginning of that square where it says rapture. That's what Guzik just described. Notice also that it doesn't show it on this chart, but I believe Brother Parr is also a pre-tribber. If I remember looking at a different chart of his, he shows the rapture as taking place right at the very beginning of what he calls the 7-year tribulation. I myself am not a pre-tribber. I'm a pre-wrather. I believe that the rapture will take place little after the midpoint, so about 3/4 of the way into the 7-year time period. Therefore, I don't call the 7-year time period the tribulation. I call it a 7-year time period, but as we're going to learn next week, I believe that there's a little bit more detail that we can see in other scriptures to help define that the tribulation doesn't start until after the midpoint of the week. But Guzik continues in point number 5, Roman numeral point number 5. The 70th week will begin when the Jewish people are restored in unbelief to their land and city, and among them will be found a faithful remnant owning their sin and seeking Jehovah's face. That's according to Henry Ironside, writing in 1911. And then as we conclude, point C in Guzik's commentary, in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Notice, if this is Jesus, if he's the he that started this whole verse in verse 27, he shall, let me pull up the passage again. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and knowing abominations will come one who makes desolate until a complete destruction. If the he is Jesus making a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, and Jesus is the one also in the middle of the week, he is putting a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And that, again, from the Christian perspective, seems to have some traction because most Christians are of the idea that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross brought an end to the animal sacrifices themselves. However, that's not how I interpret the verse myself as a Messianic Jew. I believe, again, that the he is referring to Antichrist, who's bringing this covenant to fruition with the Jewish people, not with the world in large in a salvific sense, but it's with the Jewish people in this peace, land for peace agreement. That's the covenant that he's confirming with this people for 7 years. And this same Antichrist, in the middle of the week, he'll bring an end to sacrifice and offering. This seems to accord with the other parts of Scripture that describe this midpoint of the week, where this Antichrist figure reveals his true face, his ugly face. Israel in sheer horror realizes that they'd made a covenant not of peace, but a covenant with Sheol, a covenant of death, which is confirmed in other passages. And this person marches into the temple, defiles it, declares himself to be God, according to Paul. This is the person who desecrates the temple, according to Yeshua in Matthew. This is the person that puts an end to the sacrifices in the book of Revelation as well. And so this midpoint is spoken of quite prominently in many other places in Scripture. And so because of that, that helps drive my interpretation of an understanding, what like Pastor Guzik has here, that the he is the Antichrist figure and not Jesus Christ, who's putting an end to sacrifice. That interpretation, if it does have merit, where Jesus brought the sacrifice to an end, number one, is in the spiritual sense. Because even when Jesus died on the cross, the sacrifices continued until the end of until the destruction of the temple itself, which was another almost 30 years, right? 40 years, actually. So the times are all off if it's Jesus. In the middle of the week, he brings it into sacrifice and offering. Well, the sacrifice didn't end when Jesus died on the cross. They kept going. Paul brought sacrifices. The temple was still standing when Paul was writing, right? So the temple didn't get destroyed until 70. And if Jesus died in the 30s, well, then we have a big gap of time between Jesus supposedly bringing the sacrifices to an end. I know Christians are going to tell me, but it was spiritually, not physically. It's not literally that he brought them to an end. But if we correspond this with the other verses that talk about this midpoint of week, it's the physical sacrifices that seem to make the Jewish people upset. Plus the context. In this normative reading of the ending of the sacrifices, the Jewish people are very, very, very upset with this Antichrist figure for stopping their sacrificial system, right? Based on the other verses as well, and even based on the antecedent incidents with the Antiochus Epiphanes, who defiled the temple. The Jewish people were very upset with the defiling of the temple. And the other passages seem to indicate that the Jewish people would be very upset and shocked and begin being persecuted by this Antichrist figure at this midpoint. We'll find out more details next week, but I'm giving you this teaser right now. So in the context that I take it, the effect on Israel and the temple and the Jewish people is very negative when it comes to these events that we're reading about right now, the middle of the week, the end of the sacrifice and offering, because they want sacrifice, they want offering, they want their temple. But if this guy steps in and defiles it and messes everything up, they're going to be very upset. On the flip side, contrastingly, if it's the Christian view that this is Jesus bringing the sacrifices to an end, but that's a positive for the Jewish people. They are very happy to sacrifice Jesus, right? It didn't affect the temple and its physical animal sacrifices. They were very happy to put to death this guy who's going around saying that he was God, saying that he was Messiah, doing all these miracles, healing people, etc., etc. They were very, very happy. It had a positive effect on them when Jesus was crucified. They were very, very happy. They were very pleased with that. In that sense, they put to death this troublemaker. So notice the contrasting difference depending on your interpretation of who this is. We'll talk more about this next week. But suffice to say for now, Guzik is in agreement with my perspective as well, or I'm in agreement with Guzik's, that this coming prince will break the covenant with Israel in the middle of the 7 years, the final week, the period of 7 years. That's Guzik's perspective. Let's keep reading. Roman numeral I, the book of Revelation sees this 7-year period with both its halves as yet future. We'll look at that in time. The middle of the week and the end of sacrifice had not yet happened in 90 AD. In fact, indeed, even though the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, Jewish authorities and Josephus as well attest that the sacrifices continued in secret in some shape or form for another 20 years, like I said, even up to 90 AD. So, point D by Guzik. On the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. The ending of sacrifice will come with abominations, followed by tremendous desolation. The word abominations, Guzik notes, translates an ancient Hebrew word, shikutz, that is connected to horrific idolatry. We have references to Deuteronomy and Kings. The idea is that the coming prince breaks the covenant and brings an end to sacrifice and offering by desecrating the holy place of the temple with a horrific idolatry. Again, if the coming Antichrist is the type for which Antiochus Epiphanes was the shadow, then, and we're talking about Antichrist, not Christ, but Antichrist, then just like Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple in the few centuries before Yeshua came, remember, Antiochus Epiphanes or Antiochus IV was an Antichrist figure. He's a type of Antichrist. He's not a type of Christ. He's a type of Antichrist. He's an enemy of the Jewish people, not a friend of the Jewish people. And in his role as Antichrist, he desecrated the holy place and the temple, and he desolated the place with his polluted sacrifice that he offered up on the altar. That you can read about that in the book of in the ancient books of Maccabees and in history. In like fashion, the coming Antichrist will desecrate the temple, just like Jesus prophesied in Matthew. This future Antichrist will desecrate the temple once again. Thus, he's an enemy. And notice how Jesus described the desecration of the temple as a bad thing, not a good thing. So the point I'm bringing up is that if we say that this person who stops the sacrifices in the middle of the week is Jesus, and Jesus himself described the destruction of the temple and the desecration of the temple in the middle of the week, midweek, as a negative thing, then what? Jesus is describing his own sacrifice on the cross in negative terms? It just doesn't fit. I don't follow that particular line of thinking, although again, I understand the spiritual ramifications of Jesus cutting the covenant, the new covenant, ratifying it with his blood, with the many being those who would believe in him for salvation. There's a spiritual application that can be made there, but I just don't believe Daniel's making it in these particular prophecies. Roman numeral 2, Jesus called this abomination of desolation in Matthew. He called this the abomination of desolation. We're going a little bit over just so I can finish this tonight, so just bear with me. And Jesus indicated that it would be a pivotal sign in the Great Tribulation. Paul referred to the idolatry of the coming prince in 2 Thessalonians. And then Guzik concludes, let me see, we've got some more details. These are just extra notes at the very end of Guzik, but the final note by Guzik here, point number E, until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate, this breaking of the covenant and abomination of desolation has a promised consummation before the 70th week is completed. Each of the things described in Daniel 9:24 will be accomplished, and everlasting righteousness will reign. Remember, in verse number, let me scroll back up, in verse 24, Daniel was told, and we're closing with this, Daniel was told these 6 things will happen to you and your people in the holy city. And then he lists them. You can read them there on the screen. I don't have to read them for you. Which means all of these things eventually will take place by the end of all of the 490 years. Conveniently, we could almost say that the first 3 of the 6 took place when Jesus came, and the final 3 could take place when Jesus returns the second time at a second coming. We could break it down that way, and we'll look at that next week as we begin to turn to the 70th week in particular. But in conclusion, there's a time frame here. I'm not going to look at that tonight. We'll start with this next week, where Guzik provides this little chart about the 70 weeks of Daniel as understood by Sir Robert Anderson in The Coming Prince. This kind of supplemental material, kind of excursus type material. It's not very long, but I don't want to get into it now because it'll deter me from it'll distract me from the main context of what we were talking about already. We'll start here next week. But that'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.